excellent to have talks also on this really important topic that we haven't covered earlier, so hope to have more of this later. So the first speaker is Raul Hakli, and the title you can see here for something.
Okay, thank you. My name is Raul Hakli, and I'm today asking the question whether artificial intelligence can be responsible. And the title comes from a previous workshop where I gave this talk for people in Freiburg who were interested in responsible AI. So I wanted to ask, what does it mean for AI to be responsible? And I think that there are two senses in which you can understand responsible AI. You can either think about the AI agents and robots being responsible for their actions. This is one sense in which you can ask whether AI can be responsible. And the other sense is the responsible AI use and development, which is a matter of people building robots and AI agents. And then the question is, what is the responsible way to develop and use AI and robotics? And I will argue that the first sense is not possible. AI agents themselves cannot be responsible for their actions, and this leaves only the possibility that AI development and use can be something that is either responsible or not. So basically I will be arguing that AI agents are not autonomous, but I will talk more about that later. I should also stress that the notion of responsibility I will be talking about is that of normative or moral responsibility, in contrast to other senses of responsibility, like causal responsibility, which just means that an agent is the cause of certain consequences, or legal responsibility, which is something defined in the law. As to the background, we all know that the amount of automation is increasing our societies, and algorithms and robots make lots of decisions that concern us and have consequences for our lives. And then the question arises, what happens to responsibility when we give control to algorithms and robots? Because traditionally, control has been understood as one precondition of responsibility. Someone cannot be responsible for things that they cannot control at all. On the other hand, artificial intelligence and machine learning make some of the behaviors of the AI software and robots unpredictable. So even the programmers and designers of the algorithms do not always know how the system will behave once it learns and adapts to the environment. So we don't always know the consequences of the use of these algorithms. And also, because of this, the other traditional condition of being responsible for certain consequences, namely that you have some idea of what these consequences might be, becomes debatable. So it seems that there are cases in which there are no human beings who are responsible for certain consequences. And this creates the possibility of so-called responsibility gaps. And they are situations in which there are some untoward consequences resulting from the actions of several people and the functioning of technological artifacts. And there is no individual, or not even a collection of individuals, who could be held responsible for these consequences. And for that reason, because that's an unfortunate situation that there are some bad consequences and no one is responsible for them, some people have thought of the possibility of ascribing moral responsibility to these AI agents and robots themselves. But we will argue, and this is based on work I've done together with Pekka Mäkelä, that this is a problematic view. Attribution of moral responsibility in general requires agency, so not anything that is an agent can be morally responsible for things. And then, in addition, agency is not enough, but moreover, these agents have to be fit to be held responsible. That is, they have to be moral agents. So I'm interested in the conditions of moral agency. As I said, agency is required. We take responsibility to be an agentive notion. This is basically what we mean when we say that only agents can be responsible for their actions. And usually AI software and robots can be considered agents. They function independently, and in certain respect they are agents. However, many people have argued that even if they are agents, they are not fit to be held morally responsible, for they lack certain capacities that we take morally responsible agents to have. And paradigmatic morally responsible agents, usually it is thought that, for instance, adult human beings are morally responsible agents. However, some of these arguments are based on lack of certain capacities in robots and AI agents that human beings have, but this lack of these capacities is in no way a conceptual thing, but rather something that is contingent. I will talk more about this later. Still, something about agency. What is an agent? Here is a list of rather common properties that an agent has to have. And this is from the book by Christian List and Philip Pettit. So an agent has to have certain kinds of intentional states or attitudes. First, it has to have so-called representational states that depict how the environment is. So it has to have some information about the environment that it is operating in. Second, this is not enough, because even if something has a perfect knowledge of its environment, it doesn't make it do anything, so it's not really an agent just because of that. It has also to have different kinds of intentional states or attitudes, so-called pro-attitudes or motivational states that specify how this thing or putative agent requires things to be in the environment. It has to have some motivation to do something. And a third condition is that it has to have some capacities like reasoning or deliberation that make it initiate action based on these two kinds of states. It's informational or representational states and these motivational states. So some way to put these attitudes together in order to initiate action. And these are usually understood as intentional states like beliefs, desires, and possibly intentions. So an agent is something that has beliefs, desires, and a capacity to act based on these beliefs and desires. Yes, question?
Could you maybe make a comparison with a child? Because I think a child has many of the things that we could say an AI agent might have, even more, but we don't give it legal responsibilities when it's underage. So
yes.
I think that a child would pass a lot of these tests.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, so could you make, is that a comparison that you could
It is, exactly. So we can see that a child can be considered an agent, but I've so far not said anything about moral agency. So this is the first condition, agency. The second is fitness to be held responsible. So, yes, exactly.
I don't know, the child is not cognitively fully developed, so to speak,
Yes.
the young child isn't considered legally responsible because he's not mentally at an adult.
Yes.
This is all your note.
Yes. Yes. Agreed. Okay. Well, there are some well-known arguments against the possibility of AI agents, computers, and robots to have intentional states in general, and you're certainly familiar with Searle's Chinese room argument. Here, we're not taking that line because that would we wouldn't get very far, because that would undermine the possibility of agency and responsibility from its beginning. So we will now make some commitments to theories that allow the possibility of computers or with software and robots to have these intentional states. And some theories that allow this are so-called functionalism, according to which anything that has the functional role of a belief or a desire can be considered a belief or a desire. And another account is so-called interpretationism, and according to that, we can attribute intentional states to a system based on our understanding of its behavior. So whatever way, if our best way of explaining and predicting a system's behavior is by attributing to it intentional states, then we are entitled to do that. For instance, Daniel Dennett talks about these different stances that we can take towards object. One is just to see it as a physical object. One is to see it through the way it has been designed. And the third one that is sometimes required is this intentional stance, where we attribute to a thing intentional states like beliefs and desires. So we are now committing ourselves, at least for the sake of an argument, to the idea that robots and AI agents can have beliefs and desires and certain reasoning mechanisms to initiate actions. But as I said, agency itself is not enough for capacity to be a moral agent. So it's a widely shared intuition that adult human beings are fit to be held responsible. Robots are not. But as I said, it's not easy to find conceptually strong arguments against robot responsibility or AI responsibility. The arguments are often of this form. Responsibility requires certain capacity, X, and X is either intentionality, consciousness, capacity for self-reflection, or capacity to have certain kind of higher order intentional states like second order preferences or values by which the agent evaluates its first order desires, or sensitivity to normative reasons, capacity to have emotions, or something like that. And then, because robots and AI agents do not have this capacity, they cannot be bearers of responsibility either. But of course, this is open to what we have called the engineer's objection, namely, an engineer, a clever machine learning researcher or AI researcher can say that, okay, they have higher order intentional states like higher order preferences or values, or they do not have self-reflection capacities or emotions. Well, okay, we build the next generation of AI agents and robots that have this capacity. So this is always a possibility that you can add more and more sophistication to these AI agents and robots in order to satisfy the conditions required for responsible agents. But we as philosophers would like to have something that excludes the possibility of responsible AI agents and robots altogether by the nature of their nature. Yes, question.
I think,
given all the information that you've given, and specifically that you are talking about the moral responsibility rather than legal, but assuming that even we are talking about legal responsibility, so what? I mean, assume that I'm saying that, okay, AI agent can be responsible morally or legally, so what will happen? I mean, for human beings, that's for the punishments. I don't know, send them to prison, in some countries execute them and blah, blah.
Yeah.
For so robot, I mean, let's assume that Skynet, I mean, he's responsible, so what? If you identify that the robot is responsible morally or legally, so what are the consequences? I mean, we can turn it off anytime that we want, I guess, or we cannot send him to prison or execute it?
Well, I mean, that could be one consequence at least. I mean, if we take robots and AI agents into our moral community, in the sense that we grant them responsibilities and rights, then that of course gives us certain responsibilities how we should treat them. And of course the society would be very different if we really were to grant these moral properties to robots. Just to remind that I'm not really talking about legal responsibility, not only moral responsibility, because they can come apart. And what is legal responsibility, that is specified in law, and well, you can put anything you want in the law, but it's in a sense we would like the law or legal responsibility somehow reflect the real moral responsibility. Yes.
Could you also say that one consequence would be that if in some circumstance the robot would be morally responsible, that would mean that the humans around the situation would not be, so that would resolve their responsibilities?
Well, that's possible, but it's not necessary. It could also, of course, be that both humans and these AI agents are responsible. Yes?
Well, I know that when philosophers start to discuss a concept, a singular word,
yes,
they first define the precise semantics, the meaning of this symbol. But how would you define the semantics, the meaning of the word responsibility?
Well, that's a very difficult question, but that's a very good question, because oftentimes you would think that the best way to proceed would be to first define what you mean by words and then see what the consequences are. However, that would be a problematic approach for us because there is no agreement on the exact necessary and sufficient conditions for moral responsibility. So if we were to commit ourselves to a certain sharply defined notion, then people who don't agree with that notion wouldn't listen to our argument even. So what we are saying instead is that we are starting from some widely accepted necessary conditions for moral responsibility and then try to show that these conditions are not satisfied in the case of AI agents and robots. Yes?
Right. So it's difficult and subjective to define moral responsibility.
Yes, that's very difficult. Yes.
But what we do now is we tell people that they're not morally responsible if they are not sane or if they have
Yes.
some disabilities.
Yes.
So it's there. So if an AI agent is able to pass all psychometric evaluations or whatever it is that we use to classify people as having mental disorders that relieve them from having capacity to be responsible, if it passes all those tests, would it not then be at least minimally or very close to moral, or there's no proof against it being?
There might not be a proof against it, but if my argument is correct, they would still not be more responsible. But you'll have to wait a little bit, so I will explain why.
Very close to proving that.
Yes,
it's
that's
not,
true.
You could, well, you'll be all the proofs that you could have had that it wasn't morally
Yeah.
responsible.
But I will argue that even if they behaved exactly in the ways that human beings do and passed all the tests, there would still be at least room for arguing that they are still not morally responsible. And this is how my argument will go. Okay. Our focus, as I said, is on autonomy and self-control, and we will, and these are some conditions that are usually agreed to be required for capacity to be held morally responsible. And as you know, of course, AI agents and robots are already said to be autonomous. We talk about autonomous vehicles and so on. But we argue that this engineering sense of autonomy is not really the one that is relevant for attributions of moral responsibility. In philosophy, the autonomy means something like self-governance, something like the capacity to act on the basis of one's own values and set goals to oneself. I will make a small detour to the question of whether groups can be responsible, because our argument is originally a modification of an argument against group agents. So some people have argued, Philip Petri for instance, that human groups can be morally responsible. For instance, organizations or companies could be morally responsible. And this is a case where the law says that, in fact, they can be legally responsible for their actions. But the question is whether they can be morally responsible and whether they can be morally responsible on their own right, meaning that it would be possible for a group to be responsible for some actions even though none of the individuals are morally responsible, none of the individuals constituting the group. And the argument is that because groups, their beliefs and desires are discontinuous with the beliefs and desires of the individual members, they should be attributed a mind of their own and actions of their own, and hence it would be possible to hold them responsible even though the individuals might not be. And these arguments are based on certain results like voting paradoxes and discursive dilemmas that show that groups can have attitudes that none of its members have. Pekka Mäkelä has given an argument against this, saying that this is not really sufficient for groups to be held morally responsible because the attitudes that these groups have, they are still based on the individual's attitudes in the sense that they are under the individual's control. So how groups form their attitudes is by their individuals' actions and their attitudes. So, for instance, if a group comes to have a certain aim or a goal, it is because the individuals have used some decision-making procedures like voting or whatever, so they have created these attitudes. And moreover, because groups cannot really act without the individuals acting on their behalf, the actions of groups are really constituted by actions of individuals, and they are not, in that sense, autonomous agents. And as a result, it would be unfair to hold them responsible without holding the individual agents responsible. Yes?
I get the idea that there's a psychological discontinuity between the group and the individuals, but could you still say that the group as an agent, as a collective, is still constrained by the attitudes?
Yes.
Members, that there's a bounding box, so in that sense it's severely constrained.
Yes.
Just in case that would apply to.
I think that you could say something like that. Yes.
Not yet. It occurred to me that the legal code has
Yes.
a very good definition of what it means to be legally responsible for a person. Could this be applied to an AI? The legal definition of being legally responsible, can it be applied to a program?
I suppose it could, but in some sense this is stipulative in the sense that, okay, we can define anything that we want in the law, but it doesn't necessarily come from the I would like to say real responsibility, the real moral responsibility. Okay, robots and groups, however, are not alike in all respects. So we know that robots and AI agents, they get their intentional attitudes, their desires and beliefs as a result of engineering and programming. However, by machine learning and by operating in the environment and getting feedback from their robots and AI agents can learn and change their behavior, and they become capable of acting without human control, unlike groups, which can never act without humans acting in these groups. But robots, they can learn, and they don't eventually need any operator or a controller to guide them. So in that engineering sense, robots gain autonomy. But this doesn't show that they have autonomy in the relevant philosophical sense. So robots are engineered agents. And now, in order to show that they are not fit to be held responsible, we now assume first that someone manages to build a robot that has all the capacities that typically are required for responsible and autonomous agents. And now we try to show, by using a philosophical thought experiment, that such robots or AI agents still would not be capable of being morally responsible for their actions. And for this, we start by an example by Alfred Mealy's case of psychological twins. So the case goes as follows. Anne is an autonomous agent and an exceptionally industrious philosopher. She puts in 12 solid hours a day, 7 days a week, and she enjoys almost every minute of it. Beth, an equally talented colleague, values a great many things above philosophy, for reasons that she has refined and endorsed on the basis of careful critical reflection over many years. She identifies with and enjoys her own way of life, one which she is confident has a breadth, depth, and richness that long days in the office would destroy. Their dean, who will remain nameless, wants Beth to be like Anne. Normal modes of persuasion having failed, he decides to circumvent Beth's agency. Without the knowledge of either philosopher, he hires a team of psychologists to determine what makes Anne tick, and a team of new wave brainwashers to make Beth like Anne. The psychologists decide that Anne's peculiar hierarchy of values accounts for her productivity, and the brainwashers instill the same hierarchy in Beth while eradicating all competing values, via new wave brainwashing, of course. Beth is now, in the relevant respect, a psychological twin of Anne. She is an industrious philosopher who thoroughly enjoys and highly values her philosophical work. Indeed, it turns out, largely as a result of Beth's new hierarchy of values, that whatever upshot Anne's critical reflection about her own values and priorities would have, the same is true of critical reflection by Beth. Her critical reflection, like Anne's, fully supports her new style of life. So, according to this story by Mele, Anne is autonomous. Beth is psychologically an exact copy of Anne, but she's not autonomous. Because her values have been manipulated to be the values that they are. Yes?
Isn't this the reason that the legal system has moved away from moral responsibility as a guiding principle? Because we know that Anne was also brainwashed her whole life by whatever brainwashed her.
Well, that's a very good question. That's a very good objection. But still, I would like you to consider this case, because we still think, or at least most of the people that I have given this example still have the reaction to this case that there is a crucial difference between these agents. Maybe if you don't buy that intuition, then you're not going to buy the argument, and that's fine. That's fine. Okay.
You imply that if Beth murders someone, it's the dean's fault, though. Is this what this is?
This is at least a natural reading of it. I mean, but wait. So if Beth's murdering this results from these manipulated values, then that undermines her responsibility. And yes.
Someone would have to judge if it was her who
Yes.
decided or
Yes.
if it was.
Yes.
It's very complicated.
It gets very complicated. But the main point here is that it seems that there is a critical difference between these two people. Of course, this intuition rests on the intuition that we consider normal adult human beings to be more responsible and being autonomous. Okay, so the theory of autonomy and moral responsibility by Al-Mealy is called history-sensitive externalism about autonomy and responsibility. And according to this theory, whether agents are autonomous or not depends on their causal histories, not just their psychological state and capacities that they have at the moment, but also how they came to possess these capacities and values. So the problem is, in the case of Beth, is not with possessing or lacking capacities, but so-called authenticity of the capacities. And the idea is that the normal way of getting our values and capacities is authentic, whereas one that involves manipulation and overriding the authentic autonomy or agency makes these capacities unauthentic. So, of course, this relates to robots because we can now argue that if robots could be engineered to have all the capacities required of moral agency, such engineering itself, that is part of the nature of robots and AI agents, is autonomy undermining manipulation that deprives them of the authenticity of these capacities. Here are some a little bit technical definitions, what it is, what this authenticity and compulsion mean. So according to Mealy, a necessary condition of an agent S is authentically possessing a pro-attitude P, so pro-attitude basically a desire or motivational state, that he has over an interval T is that it befalls that S is having P over that interval is compelled star, where compulsion star is compulsion not arranged by S itself. Compulsion of pro-attitude requires that the shedding, that is the eradicating or significantly attenuating of the pro-attitude, is beyond the agent's control in the sense that her psychological constitution precludes her from voluntarily producing conditions that would empower her to shed the pro-attitude. And such a pro-attitude is called practically unsheddable. And Mealy focuses on cases in which there was an autonomous agent and was then manipulated somehow. And but this idea is not necessary for his idea of compulsion, so he also considers agents that have unsheddable pro-attitudes from the start, so that they are already placed at the time of creation, and according to him, they are also reasonably viewed as being possessed of what he calls innate compelled pro-attitudes. And of course, this now applies to robots, because whatever motivations the robots have, it is something that has been programmed to them. So robots in this sense have these innate compelled pro-attitudes that undermine their autonomy. Yes?
I mean, it's just like thought that I have, but like, so there's also the problem, I would guess, that you expect more from robots than you would expect from humans at a certain point. So I mean, you could say that, yeah, like for example, you give more, let's say, in this case, you have people that are programming agents, they're doing something, they're discussing if they're responsible, more responsible. But basically, what happens in the end is like there's an autonomous car, and one is, let's say, killing someone, and this puts all in perspective the, say, kind of developments there, at least for a while. Although there are like, let's say, hundreds of thousands of accidents like every day for making this. So, I mean, I would like to know if this is also related to the fact that, of course, like we are kind of expecting this agent to behave, let's say, somehow perfectly at some point. So is it just like people do not tolerate mistakes from them? And then let's say it's kind of reversing this a bit in the sense that, like you say, like, yeah, but we gave them some programming, so they cannot be responsible. But is it also like somehow us that we cannot really tolerate mistakes, and then we find ways around to say that it's like, they cannot be responsible?
It might be, perhaps, I mean, what you're saying might be a psychological fact about how we consider them, but definitely it's not. Our idea is that we have the same criteria, and we try to determine whether humans, or whether any putative moral agent satisfies them or not. I mean, this may be something that we might do in practice, but at least according to the arguments, we should have the same criteria for both. Yes?
What's the difference between a robot and an adult who used to be a child, and when he was a child, he didn't have this moral responsibility?
Yes, well, that is a very good question, and I don't know the exact answer. So if there is no relevant difference, then they are on the same boat. So they are either responsible or not responsible. But we tend to think that human beings are morally responsible. And we tend to think that our capacities are authentic, and maybe that they are not compelled, definitely they are not manipulated, and we might get over them. So children learn, and they might be taught things, and they might adopt the values of their parents, or their friends, or whoever they happen to be in contact with, but still we tend to think that they have a capacity for critical self-reflection and assessment of these values, and perhaps be able to change them. If that's not true, then they're not responsible agents, but if it is, then they might be. And this seems to be at least one part of the answer to that. Okay, so just one word about the argument that we don't think that the argument amounts to. The argument is not just that AI and robots are programmed, hence they are not free, hence not autonomous. So this is not exactly about free will or things like that. This point has been made several times in the literature, and this is precisely the objection that you give to it, because we can argue that the same applies of us, because we have a certain upbringing, we have a certain DNA that has been coded on us, and in one sense we could say that we are also programmed because of our genetic inheritance, because of our upbringing, and because of our environment. These are the things that make us what we are. Okay, that may be true, but we still currently think that we are responsible agents, and we consider our own values and capacities authentic. So the point is not really that external influences necessarily undermine autonomy. This is even an argument that is made by people who subscribe to so-called compatibilist views on free will, according to which free will is possible even in a deterministic universe. So it's not the point of our argument that determination as such undermines autonomy. It is the kind of determination this kind of a manipulation undermines autonomy. And the main point to notice then is that it's not just about what the agent is like at the moment. So it's not just about the properties and capacities and values that the agent has that determines whether it's autonomous or not, but it's also the agent's history, how it became to be the agent it is, that may matter to judgments about responsibility. I'll skip that and go to the conclusion. So the argument aims to show that robots, due to their nature as engineered agents, cannot obtain autonomy. So robots and AI agents are not fit to be held morally responsible for their actions. And if this is a sound and valid argument, it entails that responsibility of actions of AI agents and robots cannot be attributed to themselves. And this, of course, means that all moral responsibility for consequences of AI use and development lies with us humans, either individually or collectively. So we ought not to hide behind the technology, for instance, to take it as inevitable and uncontrolled, or mystify it, but we will have to take full responsibility for our choices regarding AI use and development. And this is the starting point for responsible AI and robotics. Thank you. Yes.
The last conclusion, isn't it kind of dangerous in a way that exactly the same argument has been used by NRA in America, the National Rifle Association, and their logo that gun don't kill people, guns not people kill people, and the mass shooting problem in America is kind of skyrocketing if we, because it's exactly the same argument that they are using. I mean, technology is not responsible, people are responsible then.
Yes, right. But, I mean, I guess it is the way how you use the argument. I mean, because the National Rifle Association concludes that there's nothing wrong with guns, so we can sell and produce them and we don't have to restrict their use. But my point is rather that this is precisely something that we are responsible for. We are responsible for the consequences of producing and developing and selling guns without restrictions.
I don't know here. I can tell you why the US Constitution decrees that people have the right to bear guns. In the, say, 1900 or so, there were robbers and robs, there were bears and pumas and everything. It was necessary for the ordinary citizen to bear guns for his own safety, for bears and pumas and robbers. And they never took that right to bear guns of the Constitution because Americans behave like that. If you try to take a right from them, they start to scream and shout.
Yeah, that's true. I don't have anything to add to that.
So, as I was introduced, my name is Petri Ylikoski. Well, actually, I'm a former colleague of Raul. So, in my former life, I was a philosopher. Now I'm a social scientist. And this is my first take on using FKI slide template. Okay, so what I'm going to tell you in 5 minutes is something about the new research program, AI in Society. So this is kind of one of the new research programs in FKI. There's going to be 2 new ones in this autumn, and this adds kind of social dimension to the artificial intelligence. So this is broadly, this might be a little bit different research program than the others because it's less cohesive, but its aim is to bring cohesion and integration. So the objective of the AI in society is to bring together people doing research in cognitive science, humanities, law, social sciences, even theology, working on issues related to artificial intelligence. And the current state of affairs is that you have people doing research, having projects in these areas, but not much communication. So we had last week the first meeting of the people who are interested in participating in the research program, and there was kind of a constant findings that, you are doing the same thing as I am, I haven't heard of you. So this is one of the goals, bring together people from different disciplines and build up collaboration. Think about, for example, lawyers studying transparency in algorithms from the point of view of law. Then you have cognitive scientists dealing with understandability, philosophers dealing with epistemic opacity of the models and so on. All these things, people could do a lot of interesting things together. Second, this is not intended to be a kind of separate island on top of the FCAI, but it should also have a connection to other research programs, and especially the highlights. So highlights are especially interesting from the point of view of the, let's say, social scientists, because they are kind of real world cases that we can observe and participate to understand how AI is actually utilized, developed and adopted in the real world. And as said, we are still formulating the precise research objectives. They will be ready next month, but we are still formulating them. But here is a kind of a first glance. So I try to articulate 5 themes under which most of the research in the area goes under, and then we will highlight some of these on the basis of already ongoing projects. The first one is design and domestication of AI and its unintended consequences. So here is the idea is that wherever we are utilizing AI, is not AI alone, but it's AI used by some person, or more probably AI used by some organization. And then there's an interesting question how this interaction works and how, let's say, organizations domesticate, meaning adapt the AI system to their needs, how they selectively use them, how they modify them, how they might participate in design processes, and then looking at all kinds of unintended consequences of this process. Second, we have the understandability, which is even one of the sides of the triangle in a FCAI symbol. This is an interesting topic from the point of view of law, philosophy, cognitive science, sociology. So taking a kind of concrete idea of what understandability is, what kind of implication it has for different groups. So if you think about different audiences, they have a very different needs for understandability. Ordinary citizens don't have to understand how the algorithm works, but ordinary citizens have to understand something about the behavior of the system. Especially it should have some kind of ability to make counterfactual inferences how it would behave if a person would behave differently and so on. Then we have the AI decision making and robotics, responsibility and also foresight with respect to that. Raul's presentation was a sample of kind of philosophical approach to responsibility. What it, can we count AI systems as responsible agents, and what follows from that? Raul's argument was that, okay, what follows is that we are responsible for technological systems that we have devised, and we should take that seriously. We should also have legal responsibilities, which don't have to go hand in hand with the moral responsibility. Think about, for example, product liability. And the question is not only whether AI is responsible or humans are responsible, but who are the humans who are responsible. Think about autonomous vehicles. It's going to have a huge consequences for the development of the whole field, whether the responsible parties are the owners or the drivers of the vehicles or the companies producing the vehicles or someone else. Because we will need to have an insurance industry to cover for the damages and so on, and depending on who's paying, that will probably affect hugely what kind of autonomous vehicles we are going to have, if we are going to have them. Then we have the dimension of legitimacy and social acceptability of artificial intelligence, and this covers kind of a broad area of things that we could come up, and maybe should come up to cover, make AI systems legitimate and acceptable for people. So all kinds of arrangements that include openness and all kinds of certification processes and so on. These are necessary for people to have a trust on the systems. So although they might trust the engineers, they might not trust the companies who are implementing the systems and so on. Or they might trust the companies, might not the software and so on. So there are many dimensions of trust and acceptability here. And finally, we have the issue of data. Artificial intelligence is highly dependent on the data, and who owns the data, how it's managed, and so on. Also taking into account privacy. These are things that go under the Title 5, so governance, politics, and political economy of data. And of course, these are also going to have a huge consequences for the society. Who owns the data? What is the ownership of data, and so on. And I think that's a very brief and fast sketch of the things we are planning to work on. Any questions? Yes?
I'm not really familiar with the FCAI, but it seems like you say you're going to work on, but is it like research focused, or are you implementing this in the field companies?
These are going to be the main research topics for people working in this research program. So rather than applying AI in social sciences, we are studying the use of AI in society and the development of AI and so on. Yes?
How can you get involved?
Just contact me by me. So just email me, Petri, Ylikoski at Helsinki. So I can put you in the email list, and we are organizing Slack channels and so on during this week. And then you will have information about what's going on. Yes?
I have a question about a specific capability of AI that might relate to its acceptability to the general public.
Yes?
Of course, the state of machine learning is that you see that you'll reproduce the prejudices of your input set. For example, you have AIs that are racist, that recreate the problems in their input data. I think it was the EU that said they had a goal that an AI would be able to basically explain its reasoning process. And at some point would be able to say, well, the way I got to this is this, and that would remove the black box aspect. Is this an element of the development program here to remove this black box thing and make it more, I'd call it transparent to the general public?
Of course, it's a challenge for AI researchers to make it more understandable and transparent in terms of the technology, but also for us is to figure out what this understandability actually means. And this is actually the challenge for the legal scholars, because you have the EU legislation talking about understandability. But what does it actually mean? There's no legal precedent, and then understanding the systems might be a challenge even for developers, how it could be requirement for ordinary users. So there's a lot of area to cover that covers both conceptual issues and empirical issues, what kind of things people can do, what they expect to understand from the system, and then, of course, building such systems that face people's needs.
For example, a bank that's, it turns out the AI is doing mortgage redlining. And they say, well, how did this happen? And the bank says, well, actually, if we look at the data, actually, we have been redlining for 30 years. And so, the different parties have different motivations for lack of transparency or secrecy.
Yes. And this belongs to number 4. So we probably have to think about how organizations work and how we check the data. And if you find biases in the data, of course, there has to be some way of figuring out, okay, we might correct those biases, but then there's a tricky question in political philosophy: what is the kind of a correct baseline towards which we should correct the biases? So we might agree that there's a bias, but then we don't necessarily agree on what is the state where we don't have biases, and whether it's acceptable, for example, compensate for some biases, because we might be compensating different people that have been actually offended by the earlier practices.